Is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea? Then, the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Carsick Caleb, and today we have a couple weird news stories for you. We're going to be starting off with some researcher-related stories, one of which has my favorite titles I've ever heard. Quote, researchers one step closer to bomb-sniffing cyborg Locust. In the second segment, we'll get to my most bizarre stories, including a man who saved his wife by punching a shark. Nice heroic story for you there. In the third section, we will wrap up the weird news with a 12-year-old girl who was caught on camera gambling at a casino. Then in the end, I'll give you my top 10 assassinations. Most interesting ones, weirdest ones, and of course the most important ones. Now let's jump into the weird news, with researchers that are claiming that they are one step closer to bomb-sniffing cyborg locusts. Now, this all began in the Washington University in St. Louis, who demonstrated both the ability to control the locusts and the ability to read their brains. All of this in an effort to discern whether or not it is smelling the proper element. If a certain pattern of elements are smelled, then they have a bomb on their hands. In their written Journal of Biosensors and Bioelectronics, researchers said, quote, we are able to hijack a locust olfactory systems in order to both detect and discriminate between different explosive scents, all within a few hundred milliseconds of exposure. Which is great news. Every 100 milliseconds counts when you're defusing a bomb. Alright, they go on to say, quote, we were also able to optimize a previously developed bio-operatic sensing system that could detect the locusts' firing neurons and convey that information in a way that told researchers about the smells the locusts were sensing. They do go on to say, however, that, quote, we don't know if they'd be able to smell or pinpoint the explosives because they don't have any meaningful ecological significance. So it turns out back in the day, locusts didn't have to worry about bombs, so they didn't evolve to sense bombs. They go on to say, quote, it was possible that they didn't care about any of the cues that were meaningful to us in this particular case. So what they did in order to discover what each of these locusts would think when smelling each smell is they attached it to a wheelchair and then had it go around a plastic box. And as the researchers would send that wheelchaired locust to each smell, they would record its brain activity in order to see if there were any similarities or constant unique reactions that they could detect while the locust was smelling each individual smell. They said as a result, quote, most surprisingly, we could clearly see the neurons responding differently to TNT and to DNT, as well as these other explosive chemical vapors. With that crucial piece of data, we were ready to go to work. We were optimized. Finally, the latest development in this research project, they actually found a way to not harm the locusts while still being able to test their neural activity. So their new surgical procedure includes, quote, attaching electrodes that don't hinder the locust movement. With their new instrumentation in place, the neuronal activity of a locust exposed to an explosive smell was resolved into a discernible odor-specific pattern within 500 milliseconds. Now we can implant the electrodes, seal the locusts, and transport them to mobile environments. They wrap up by saying, quote, "This is not that different from the old days when coal miners used canaries. People use pigs for finding truffles. It's a similar approach, using a biological organism. This is just a bit more sophisticated." I think that's a perfect way to wrap up this story by calling it sophisticated. Alright, next story is a renowned climate scientist who died after falling through ice in Greenland. Now, please be warned, I'm going to laugh throughout this entire story, just because I like irony, and I have a sadistic sense of humor. But I will start by saying that it is very sad. This famous United States-Swiss climate scientist and geologist died last Saturday while doing research in Greenland. He was a sobering 68, and it's pretty tragic the way he left us all. Apparently he fell into a deep crevasse full of water. This occurred after snow and ice gave way beneath him while he was working near his weather station. Rescue attempts were, of course, made, but apparently the crevasse was so deep that not only could they not help him, but his body was never found. The ice climatologist at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, who was with the man before he died, said that he believes his friend, quote, "remains 8 meters down in the water." It's so sad, but it's just funny the way they put it. The man goes on to say, quote, "Personally, the man was like a father, an immense man, an immense loss. Tears falling around the world." Sad indeed. The man who died was apparently the scientific director at the Swiss Polar Institute and the director of the Swiss Federal Institute for Forest, Snow, and Landscape Research, or WSL. WSL is short for Swiss Federal Institute for Forest, Snow, Landscape Research. You learn something new every day, folks. Anyway, the WSL said in response to the man's death, quote, "We have not only lost the director of our institute, but also a committed scientist, and above all, a unique and generous person and friend. We will all miss him." It is said that the man who died is so famous that he has over 15,000 academic citations. He has also been pursuing climate science for about 40 years now, mostly in the Arctic and Antarctic. And he was also a teacher at the University of Boulder, Colorado, and the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. And Al Gore had to say on the matter. I wish I could get Al Gore to write in on every story I have. Unfortunately, this is one of the rare times where we get to savor his opinion. Al Gore said, quote, "He's renowned for his work as a glaciologist." Hold on, I pronounced that incorrectly. A glaciologist, and has been instrumental in the world's deep-ended understanding of the climate crisis. He has been a positive influence on our campus and countless students. I'm thankful we had him here. Rest in honor. I wish I could have him comment on everything. It's just the way he phrases everything. It's so brilliant. Brilliant! Alright. Unfortunately, there is not much more to this story except for the meditation that he was a glaciologist who was trying to understand the effects of climate crisis and ended up falling through ice as his final hurrah. Which is not funny that it happened, but it's kind of funny how it happened. Okay, next story. A Chinese restaurant apologizes for weighing its customers. So just a little background, this restaurant in central China has a policy where they encourage diners to weigh themselves before they actually order their food. The policy was introduced after a national campaign against food waste, which was launched in China. As a response, the beef restaurant in the city of Changsha placed 2 large scales at its entrance in order to accommodate customers and reduce possible food waste. What they would do then is ask diners to enter their measurements into an app that would then suggest menu items accordingly. They had 2 slogans added to their advertisement. One of them was, quote, "Be thrifty and diligent, promote empty plates." Another one was Operation Empty Plate. So they're taking this all very seriously. However, the Chinese response was not all that positive. Most of it came from social media, so of course it almost couldn't have been positive. Hashtags about the restaurant have been viewed more than 300 million times on social platforms such as Weibo. In response, the restaurant said, quote, "We are deeply sorry," which I think is kind of a weak response. It's one of the weaker apologies I've heard. "We are deeply sorry." They go on to say, quote, "We are deeply sorry for our interpretation of the National Clean Plate campaign. Our original intentions were to advocate stopping waste and ordering food in a healthy way. We never forced customers to weigh themselves," which is both a true and funny response. I'm not quite sure why everybody got so upset in the first place. They could have just gone to the restaurant's competitor instead. But I guess people like outrage. I like being outraged. It's fun. It's fun being angry. Especially if it's a product of no consequence like beef. Anyways, this whole campaign started as a result of Xi Jinping, the president of China's campaign in order to lower the waste of food, saying, quote, "It was shocking and distressing." As a result, many other restaurants in the city limits will now only serve a certain number of dishes to each individual diner, implementing a system where groups have to order 1 dish fewer than the number of diners, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you have 6 people, you should be able to order 6 meals, but apparently they're only allowed to order 5 now. But that is all we have for that particular story. We are now going to move on to the last one of this segment, a Florida man. This is my Florida story of the week, by the way. A Florida man floods his jail cell by repeatedly flushing the toilet. That's clever. I never would have thought of that. So this happened in Melbourne, Florida, where the man repeatedly flushed his toilet in order to flood his jail cell area, and then he proceeded to make a death threat towards one of the officers, who eventually took him into custody. This all began with the arrest of the man. He was arrested for stealing a Schwinn bicycle from somebody's garage. And even though the bike was actually given back to the victim before the man was arrested, he still pressed charges because he caught the felon on video. As well as saying, quote, "My family was home at the time." I can't have bicycles stolen from my front yard when my kids are watching. Ridiculous. Anyways, the police say that they located the man and had him taken into custody. However, once placed in a cell, the man was accordingly, quote, "extremely irate." He started banging on cell doors and then flushed the cell toilet repeatedly until the booking room flooded. Because of this, he ended up in Brevard County Jail. He berated the officer with racial and homophobic slurs, which is not a good thing. And I don't think it'll look good for him trying to get out of here. All he did was steal a $150 bike. I think he's just making it worse for himself now. And his most offensive threat of law enforcement came in the form of him saying, quote, "You're going to be killed when this is over," which he said to his arresting officer as they pulled up to the jail. As a result, Adams is not just facing a occupied burglary grand theft charge, he is also facing a threatening of a law enforcement officer charge. So, he's not going unscathed for that. Which is pretty sad. He could have just kept his mouth shut and he would have been out a lot earlier than he's going to be now. All he did was steal a $150 bike, and now he's being threatened for himself threatening law enforcement. Alright, that's all we have for this god-dang segment. Stay tuned to the next one, and I'll tell you about a god-dang Australian surfer who saved his wife by punching the shark that was attacking her. We also have one where brothels reopen in Berlin, but no sex is allowed. That'll be fun. Stay tuned. Eventually I'm going to give you my top 10 assassinations in history. So stay tuned for all of that.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We just talked about some goddamn cyborg locusts. Very interesting stuff. We also did my Florida story of the week, in which a man flushed his way out of prison before immediately getting thrown back in prison. And so now we're going to go into my weirdest stories of the week. We will get to the Australian surfer who saved his wife by punching a shark, but we're going to actually start off with this one. A historic bridge, which was damaged by a truck in 2018, finally reopened. And then a school bus ran into it and damaged it again. This is just a night Q story. That's why we're going to start off with this one. It took only 24 hours after reopening for the bridge to be re-damaged by the yellow school bus. The bridge itself was seriously damaged back in 2018 when an overweight box truck plowed into the structure. And it wasn't until 2 years later, last Friday, when the structure reopened with much fanfare and celebration. If you're going to celebrate the opening of historic bridges, maybe you need something else to do with your time. Anyways, apparently this nice old lady was driving in the bus when, quote, her GPS warned her that she should not proceed with the type of vehicle she was driving. The occupants of the bus convinced her to proceed, which she did, and subsequently struck the bridge. The bus was rented for hire, and charges are pending against the poor old 44-year-old woman in Chicago. That's sad. Thankfully, no injuries were reported, and motorists were still able to drive through the damaged bridge by Saturday. When asked for his response to the situation, the president of the Grove said, quote, "There were some folks taking bets on when the first person was going to hit the bridge, but no one thought it would happen that quickly, right?" The man goes on to say, "Unbelievable. I got a text at 12:30 p.m. I was cutting my grass and said, 'You're not going to believe this. You've got to come down here. There's a school bus stuck underneath the bridge.'" The good news is that although the wood was damaged on the bridge, the steel structure we put in place is just fine. There's really limited damage to the bridge itself. The structures that we put in there to reinforce it protected the bridge. Excellent, great news. I am going to get this repaired, and we are going to make other measures in order to try to prevent this in the future. So this president of the Grove is very motivated when it comes to his bridge, and all the better for him. Now, if you want to go online and delve into the history of this bridge, you are free to do so. In fact, this article goes on to do that, but I'm going to go ahead and skip over it. If you guys are upset, leave a comment below about how I didn't dive into the history of the bridge. We're going to move into the Australian surfer who saved his wife by punching a shark. Quote, "A man leapt from his surfboard onto a shark that was attacking his wife, repeatedly punching the animal until it let go." The 35-year-old man was surfing off of Shelley Beach at Point Macquarie, which is in New South Wales, when the attack took place. The husband punched the shark repeatedly, and eventually the shark let its grip go. The man then helped his wife to the shore, where she was airlifted to a hospital with serious injuries to her right leg. Experts said that the nice lady had been mauled by a juvenile great white shark, which was probably around 3 meters or 10 feet long. The NSW chief executive said in response, quote, "This fella paddled over and jumped off his board onto the shark and hit it to get it to release her and then assisted her back to the beach. Pretty full on, really heroic." I like how they all sound like surfer bros in this story. He goes on to say, quote, "The bystanders on the scene that rendered assistance should be commended. They did an amazing job." He's saying this because several people on the beach were qualified and prepared to use first aid care on the nice lady once she arrived on shore. Unfortunately, this is actually the third most serious shark attack that has occurred on this coast in recent months. Thankfully, the nice lady was sent to Newcastle Hospital for surgery, and she is now in stable condition. Alright, next story. A man in Bangor, Maine, is charged with an attempt to steal a car. He was seen hitting his victim with a Bible. Alright, so as previously mentioned, this happened in Maine, and the man is facing charges. The 27-year-old man facing charges for robbery and assault. Apparently, police department officials say that they responded to a report of an attempted car theft on Broadway Street last Sunday morning. They say a family had stopped on the side of the road to take pictures when the man tried to steal their car. The driver of the car noticed that somebody was in his driver's seat, and that is when the police say the struggle ensued. Apparently, the assaulting man hit the vehicle's owner with what was believed to be a copy of the Bible. According to authorities, the man was pulled from the vehicle and fled on foot, and was eventually found behind a house on a cedar tree. And don't worry, the Bible was found too, so he'll have something to read while he rests in jail. Alright, next outrageous story. A penguin waddling in Broxtowe was picked up by police. So for those who don't know, Broxtowe is in England, and apparently there were several police officers patrolling the area of England near Nottinghamshire, and they spotted a Humboldt penguin. This was in a simple village street in the early hours of last Sunday. The bird, who was nicknamed Popo, had escaped from his farm enclosure in Strelly and then made his way a mile up the road, where he was found. The police officers said that they were sad to return him back to his owner later that evening, saying, quote, "He posed for some pictures with us and he was very friendly with our officers." Isn't that sweet? This returns the police to about a year ago, where a pair of stolen penguins were rescued by the same officers in Strelly, not too far away. In 2019, the men arrested the birds. Goodness gracious, they rescued the birds and arrested the 23-year-old man who had stolen them. That's sad. Of course, these are not Arctic or Antarctic penguins. They would not be able to survive in England if they were. They are actually native to South America. And they're actually named after the current of water in which they swim. I bet that's really interesting for you listeners, isn't it? Anyways, while not considered an endangered species, they are, quote, vulnerable, as labeled by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So, if you see any goddamn penguins wandering around your village streets, why don't you give the police a ring? Alright, I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more stories before the break. Starting off with the pre-advertised Berlin brothels, which are reopening after lockdown, with no sex allowed. Apparently, these brothels have been closed for several months and are finally reopening. However, full-on sex is still off limits. One German reporter said, quote, clients looking for sexual healing in the German capital will have to make do with erotic massages until regulations are further relaxed in September. That's pretty amazing that erotic massages are still allowed. I mean, I'm pretty sure those are illegal in America, whether or not lockdown is happening. But apparently they are legal in Germany, even though they still have strict regulations and health codes to follow. However, it should be mentioned that it is not just customers alone who are suffering from this gross violation of human rights. Apparently, one of the longtime sex workers said, quote, I prefer the sexual service. My clients do too. Oh, that's sad. Apparently all she can do now is go around making beds and fluffing the animal print pillows. That's so sad. Apparently now they are also introducing fresh flowers in order to keep things, fresh. It's so sad. Anyway, sex work has been banned in Berlin since mid-March as part of the efforts to control the spread of coronavirus. The ban continued through July when there were actually several protests, the most notable of which occurred when a dozen prostitutes armed with inflatable sex dolls staged a protest outside of Bundesrat, upper house of parliament in Berlin, complaining that continued restrictions were preventing them from making a living and pushing their trade underground. Of course, underground sex acts are not common in Germany, as prostitution is legal. The country actually has around 40,000 registered sex workers entitled to employment contracts and social security benefits. As a result of the current restrictions, brothel operators have actually seen a six-figure loss in profits. Goodness gracious, that's abysmal. Just in the past several months since closure began. One man said he has to invest more to make sure that the establishment meets coronavirus requirements, and the lack of money coming in does not help. That's one hell of a businessman there. So although people cannot have sex in the brothels, they can still enter it and kind of just look around, I guess. Apparently, quote, everybody who visits the brothel must fill out a form with contact details, which are kept in a sealed envelope. This is so that if coronavirus has indeed broken out through the brothel, they will be able to contact the people who might have contracted it. They are also required to wear masks, quote, just like in the supermarket, in the gas station, and in the subway. And of course, most are happy to do so. However, the owner of the brothel has come out and said, what doesn't work so well, however, is that my guests come to a brothel with the expectations that they will get sex here. I'm glad he's really figuring out his business plan. That's the key to a good brothel, is allowing people to have sex in it. Alright. It is expected that strict hygiene regulations will remain in place once full sex is on the offer again in September 1. So that's when September begins. Once it does, Berlin will start allowing sex work once again in parts of Germany. However, when asked, one of the sex workers said that she didn't care about catching coronavirus. Quote, when you've been doing the job for 20 years and you have your regulars, you can choose who you take. If you don't like him, you send him back through the door. I'm not afraid at all. I'm just happy. Finally. Well, isn't that fine? Fine and dandy. Okay. We're going to do a quick story before the break. This one's not really much of a story, actually, but this happened early last week when a small baby bear found its way onto the porch of a North Carolina home. The family said, quote, we heard clanging outside our bedroom window that bucks up to our front desk. Sure enough, when I put our front deck lights on, there was a cub in the front door. So there was this little tiny bear cub. And when they were staring at it, a giant mama bear comes by and grabs its little cub by the neck and manages to toss it off the deck. You can go online and watch the video. It's quite entertaining because the first 2 minutes is just the cute little cub bear playing with the window like a little dog, and then his mom comes and says, "What the hell are you doing?" and throws him off the porch. The family started recording once they saw the bear peeking into their window, which is really cute. They said, quote, "We remember thinking, this is really cool." Great quote there from the actual primary resource. And then once the mama bear threw her child off the deck, the woman filming the video says, quote, "It is so relatable. That's my daily experience with my own children. I think that's what made this video so great. It showed that some aspects of parenting are uniform across species." I think she's right. That is beautiful. So yeah, if you want to go look at that video online, you are free to do so. It's pretty adorable and funny. But for now, we're going to have to go to a break. Stay tuned. Our next segment's coming up, and we're going to talk about a 12-year-old who was caught in a casino gambling. And then we're going to move on to the fourth and final segment, in which I'll give you my top 10 god-dang assassinations of all of ever. So why don't you stay tuned for that.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We just did my outrageous stories of the week. Now we're going to do my god-dang controversial stories of the week, starting with a 12-year-old girl who was caught on camera gambling at an Australian casino. This occurred at the casino called the Star Sydney. This is according to the Liquor and Gaming New South Wales state regulator. That's quite the title. Anyways, this is among one of the largest casinos in the country and has been fined about 64,000 US dollars or 90,000 Australian dollars for an instance in which a young girl was caught gambling. It should also be noted that 2 other cases of minors gambling have been served alcohol as well. The regulators released surveillance footage which showed the preteen being sneaked into the casino by her mother, who held an exit door open for her to avoid security. She could then be seen gambling alongside both her parents for 17 minutes, placing almost 24 bets on several poker machines. The NSW authority chair said, quote, "It's quite staggering that the young girl's parents facilitated her entry in such a deceptive manner, let alone allowed her to gamble." The director of investigations said that underage patrons trying to sneak in through the exit doors was fairly obviously a risk in which the casino had failed to manage. He then went on to add, quote, "There were a lot of opportunities where staff should have noticed a very young person playing the poker machines well before they actually did, which was when the family was leaving. So it wasn't until the family gave away and lost all their money that the casino apprehended them." In a similar incident, a 16-year-old lady entered the casino through a VIP area. She did this with the help of a middle-aged member, and she was not asked for identification at the entrance, and was later served alcohol at the casino bar, where she presented a driver's license which supposedly belonged to her. The girl was not caught until she attempted to enter a nightclub attached to the casino, where security noticed a mismatch between her and her proposed ID. The casino boasts that they constantly practice the responsibility of serving alcohol, and guests must be 18 years or over to enter the casino. Of course, Australia is like most of Europe in that it allows drinking at the age of 18 rather than the age of 21 as is common in the US. Nevertheless, a 17-year-old boy also managed to enter the casino last week, and he stayed there for more than 3 hours before security escorted him out. During that time, he had bought alcohol and played 42 rounds of roulette and 22 hands of poker. The investigator said, quote, "Both children's forays lasted long enough that they had interacted with several staff members by the time they were discovered." So the investigator is saying that the casino should have these children questioned before they were allowed to play games. Since that did not happen, the children were not caught until much later. The casino did not try to hide these 3 cases in which minors entered their casino unlawfully. They were in fact the ones who reported it to the NSW. And the NSW also mentions that the casino reported in 2019 alone some 32 minors who gained access to the restricted areas in the casino, which is actually a shrinking number from 35 in 2018. The NSW says, quote, "We appreciate the STAR's cooperation in coming forward each time they detect a minor. However, we do take these cases seriously. The penalty indicates that every branch requires a regulatory response befitting the risk of harm to young people and the community." As a result, the incidents involving the 16 and 17-year-olds resulted in 2 $10,750 fines, and the incident involving the 12-year-old resulted in a $43,000 fine. Goodness gracious. Making this the largest fine to ever be handed out to a casino for allowing minors into their casino. Previously, the largest fine was around $5,000 in Australia. And that's the end of that story. Time to move on to my second controversial story, in which Tokyo has public restrooms that are now see-through. Pretty odd. So, of course, at first, it's hard just to kind of fathom that they would make these public restrooms transparent. But now they are saying that it's designed in order to ease toilet anxiety. So I don't know if they're using reverse psychology or something. We'll find out as we read through this article. Apparently this all began as an effort to, quote, "cure the public's phobia of toilets that are dark, dirty, smelly, and scary." This was an effort by the non-profit organization, the Nippon Foundation, which launched the, quote, "Tokyo Toilet Project." Goodness gracious, none of what I said makes sense, but we're gonna just run along with it. The whole idea of the project is to take 16 well-known architects and have them renovate 17 public toilets located in the public parks in the commercial areas of Tokyo. The overall mission was designed to apply innovative designs in order to make public bathrooms accessible for everyone regardless of gender, age, or disability, with the goal, quote, "that people will feel comfortable using these public toilets and foster a spirit of hospitality for the next person." Of course, the most talked about design came from one designer whose transparent restrooms popped up last month in the Haruno Ogawa Community Park. There are actually 2 different unions, each of which has 3 cubicles, which are surrounded by transparent glass. He made sure to make these see-through bathrooms nice and colorful as well, one of them being cyan, lime green, blue, yellow, pink, and purple. And he also boasts that the see-through design actually has a practical reason, which is to allow a person to easily check inside before entering. Quote, "There are 2 concerns with public toilets, especially those located in parks. The first is whether it is clean inside, and the second is that no one is secretly waiting inside." Yeah, that took a dark turn. The design relies on a new smart glass technology that turns the walls opaque when the door is locked. At night, they light up in the parks like a beautiful lantern. This is all according to the Nippon Foundation, by the way, the people funding this design. Anyway, I'm glad to see that in the age of stagnation, we can finally see some development in some of our oldest utilities. Alright, let's move right along. Controversy. A Lego piece falls out of a New Zealand boy's nose after being stuck for 2 goddamn years. This is a story I can relate to. A missing piece of Lego was said to have been pushed up the child's nose about 2 years ago. He was only 7 at the time. It was 2018, 2 years ago, for people who aren't good at math. Anyway, the boy's father and mother became alarmed when their son told them that he had lost a piece of Lego up his nose and they couldn't find it. The parents, of course, took their son to the GP, who also was unable to find or remove the piece. The doctor advised them that the piece could move through their son's digestive tract if it had even been there in the first place. So the doctor doesn't really believe the child, saying that, quote, the boy did not show any signs of pain or distress. And as a result, the parents soon forgot about the ordeal. Anyway, the boy's father said, since he's never complained or anything, we did not see anything wrong. In fact, it was quite playful and a mischievous character. Anyway, the child believed that the piece that was stuck up his nose was part of a Lego arm. I think it was the hand piece. Anyways, it wasn't until about a week ago when the, quote, unbelievable happened. A plate of pink cupcakes prompted the son to lean down and take a great big sniff of them. Immediately, his nose began to hurt. Quote, thinking he'd sniffed up some cake crumbs, his mother helped him blow his nose, hoping to thoroughly clear his nostrils. But instead of pink cake crumbs, out dropped the tiny piece of black Lego. Isn't that amazing? Another happy ending on the Weird News podcast. Quote, we never expected such a thing. The Lego piece looks a bit gross, but that's how it is. Unbelievable. Apparently, once the boy discovered that he had just sneezed out a Lego piece, he said, quote, Mom, I found the Lego. You were telling me it wasn't there, but it was there. That's cute. Alright, that's it for that story. I don't know why that's in the controversy section, but nevertheless it is. Okay, next story. The Pentagon establishes a new task force in order to investigate UFOs. I didn't want to get to this story, but we have run out of other stories. I was hoping I'd never have to talk about aliens on the Weird News podcast, but here we are. Alright, the Pentagon has stated that under growing pressures from Congress, it has established a new high-level body to investigate reports of, quote, unidentified aerial phenomena, which was following multiple incidents in recent years of UFOs reportedly intruding into military airspace. So for those of you who aren't interested in aliens like me, over the past year there have been a lot of videos popping up taken from the military themselves saying that they have recorded alien spaceships. You can go online and watch these videos. Of course, they're taken on a 1-pixel camera, so you won't really see anything but a blob. Nevertheless, the fact that the Army is saying that they actually saw these flying objects, this is now being investigated. One Pentagon spokeswoman said, quote, the Department of Defense established a UAPTF to... That's the name of the organization that's investigating the UFOs. They founded the UAPTF to improve its understanding of and gain insight into the nature and origins of UAPs, which I think is unidentified aerial phenomena. She goes on to say, quote, the mission of the task force is to detect, analyze, and catalog UAPs that could potentially pose a threat to the U.S. national security. Well, isn't that fine? Fine and dandy. All right. The new high-level organization is being led by the same man who actually led a previous Pentagon UFO research program known as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Intelligence Program, or the AATIP. This was dissolved way back in 2012, so I'm actually glad to hear that it was dissolved back in 2012. It shows that the government can indeed dissolve some of their organizations, although they don't do it very often. I would imagine that UFOs is a good one to try to dissolve after a certain amount of time. Hopefully they have a date for this new one that they are forming. Anyways, it is said that this man previously resigned, in part over the frustration that his senior Pentagon officials were not taking seriously enough a series of unexplained encounters, including those experienced by pilots flying off the aircraft carriers, the USS Nimitz and the Theodore Roosevelt, both in 2004 and 2015, who reported unknown aircraft maneuvering in ways that appeared to defy aerodynamics. It should be noted, however, that the Navy last year has updated its reporting guidelines for such sightings to more comprehensively collect new data. And earlier this year, the Navy made 3 public videos of the Nimitz and Roosevelt incidents. So they actually didn't release those videos from 2004 or 2014 until last year. One Floridian senator said, quote, "We have things flying over our military bases and places where we are conducting military exercise, and we don't know what they are, and it isn't ours." So that's a legitimate question to ask. And I think we're going to end on that nice quote. There's a bit more to go into, so if you'd like to, Google and research UFOs, you can do so. I'm not going to go into it because it doesn't interest me. Alright, we're going to take a break. Stay tuned and we'll get back to my top 10 assassinations.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We're going to go into now my top 10 assassins of all time. We're going to do the most interesting ones, the most important ones. And I don't really have an order here, so it'll be sort of random. As though doing an assassination top 10 isn't already random. I mean, this is the Weird News Podcast. They're not very similar subjects, but here we are. Alright, number 10. John F. Kennedy. And we're also going to throw Robert F. Kennedy into this number 10 spot as well. Kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Alright. So JFK was obviously the 35th President of the United States, who was assassinated in public Friday, November 22nd, 1960-3. This occurred at 12:30 p.m. in the great state of Texas. Small city of Dallas, Texas, while the president was riding in the president motorcade. He was presently with his wife, Jacqueline, and the Texas governor, John Connally. It is suspected that JFK was allegedly shot by the former U.S. Marine Lee Harvey Oswald, who fired in ambush from a nearby building. Governor Connally was seriously wounded by the attack. However, Kennedy was pronounced dead only 30 minutes after the shooting. It only took about 70 minutes after the shooting took place for the Dallas Police Department to arrest Oswald. He was eventually charged for the murder of JFK, as well as one of the Dallas policemen, J.D. Tippit, who was shot shortly after the president's death. And we're going to throw this assassination under number 10 as well. The Lee Harvey Oswald assassination. Oswald was actually also fatally shot on live television while cameras were covering his transfer from city jail to county jail. This occurred in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters by Dallas nightclub operator Jack Ruby. He was taken to the hospital where he died, and Ruby was eventually convicted of Oswald's murder, though it was later overturned on appeal. It wasn't until 10 months later that the Warren Commission eventually concluded that Oswald assassinated Kennedy alone. Many people have since written many a conspiracy theory saying that Oswald did not act alone, that he had help from aliens or Canadians or Russians, whatever. There's a conspiracy theory from every angle when it comes to this assassination. But that's a different top 10 list. Alright, number 9, let's go ahead and do Robert F. Kennedy, get this out of the way. Alright, so RFK was a presidential candidate in 1968. He was mortally wounded shortly after midnight at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. This occurred only after he was declared the winner in the South Dakota and California Democratic presidential primaries. After his dual victories, the senator spoke to journalists and campaign workers at a live televised celebration. However, shortly after leaving the podium and exiting through a kitchen hallway, he was mortally wounded by several multiple shots fired from a handgun. The shooter was 24-year-old Sirhan Sirhan. I don't know how to pronounce that without sounding racist. Mr. Sirhan was convicted of murdering the senator and was sentenced to death. Of course, this death also incurred many conspiracy theories, which we will not get into at the current moment. Number 8. Roman Emperor Commodus. I like this one. This one's a good revenge plot, as he was actually killed by his wife, who poisoned his food. However, eventually he couldn't keep the food down. His body ejected it, shall we say. And then his wife actually had his wrestling partner strangle him to death in his bath. So this all began due to the fact that Commodus was a goddamn jerk. He was said to be extremely narcissistic, and he had stressed that his godlike powers were the reason that he was king. In fact, he erected statues of himself, and after the city was largely damaged by a fire, he renamed Rome after himself. And he finally even changed the months of the year to correspond with his 12 names. So yeah, a bit of a narcissist. And his wife got sick of him, so she went ahead and murdered him. And after his death, it was largely celebrated. The Senate declared him a public enemy and restored original names to Rome and its institutions. Even the man's statues were taken down. I like that one. It's nice and funny. Now we're going to move on to a not so funny one. John Lennon, who was assassinated by Mark David Chapman, and Chapman told his wife that he had been obsessed with killing Lennon for many, many years. And it was also said that he was inspired to do it as a result of reading Catcher in the Rye. He was inspired by a book to murder John Lennon. That's a pretty good excuse. Of course, for those who do not know, John Lennon is a member of the Beatles. There's not much to it more than that. So this assassination actually begins several months before the assassination date, December 8th, 1980. And apparently this good old Chapman fella was waiting for several months before he murdered Lennon. He would stalk him around his home estate of the Dakota, which is John Lennon's New York City estate. And one night he followed John Lennon and Yoko Ono from their recording studio back to their apartment. After having the international superstar sign his his copy of Double Fantasy, one of John Lennon's albums, the assassin pulled out a .38 special revolver and shot Lennon 5 times, only 4 of which hit, but it was enough to kill him on the spot. Apparently the murderer just sat there and read Catcher in the Rye, the book which he said inspired him to shoot Lennon, until police cruisers arrived and arrested him. Lennon was rushed to the Roosevelt Hospital where he was pronounced dead on the spot. Apparently, the assassin has stated that he was angered by Lennon's lifestyle and public statements, especially his much publicized remark about the Beatles being, quote, more popular than Jesus, and the lyrics to John Lennon's later songs God and Imagine. Truly a tragic, tragic death, and people had a very strange reaction to it. Apparently 3 Beatles fans committed suicide as a result of the death, as a result of the assassination, and many buildings nearby his estate were burned down because people were lighting too many candles in their windows in order to honor the great rock star. So quite a weird aftermath as well. Let's go ahead and move on to number 7. This one will be nice and quick because it makes me sad. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. This great American clergyman and civil rights leader was fatally shot in the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was shot by James Earl Ray, a fugitive from the Missouri State Penitentiary, who was later arrested. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 99 years in the Tennessee State Penitentiary. He eventually died in prison in 1998. His only claim to guilt was saying that he was part of a conspiracy. He never fully gave his motive, and King's family suspects that it was the work of the U.S. government or the mafia or the Memphis State Police, who hired the man to assassinate the great Martin Luther King Jr. Rest in peace, number 6. Julius Caesar. I'm not going to delve too deeply into this one either, because there are many great books on it. Also several great plays. So basically, he was assassinated by a group of senators on the Ides of March, the 15th of March, 44 BC, during a meeting of the Senate. The senators stabbed Caesar 23 times in order to send a message, probably. The senators claim that they are acting in fear that Caesar's unprecedented concentration of power during his dictatorship was undermined in the Roman Republic, and presented the deed as an act of tyrannicide, which is when you kill a tyrant, and just a way to vilify what they did. Apparently 60 different senators were part of the conspiracy, and it was led by Julius's great friends Marcus Brutus, Gaius Cassius, and Domitius Brutus. Of course, their goal was to hold together the Republic, which subsequently fell into war as all of these great senators thought they should be the new Julius Caesar. And obviously that led to lots of fighting, which led to most of them dying. Fantastic, a beautiful, nice little revenge plot that doesn't end so well. There are a lot more details on this one, but I'm going to let you look those up if you so care to do so. We're going to move on to number, what are we at? 5. Malcolm X. So this one is very, very interesting to me, as I'm sure it is for anybody who's read his autobiography. It is a wonderful book. I recommend you read it whether or not you agree with him, because it is quite an amazing story either way. He was murdered by Talmadge Hayer, Norman Butler, and Thomas Johnson, and their motive was that Malcolm X had defected from the Nation of Islam, of which his assassins were part of. So, obviously, Malcolm X was a big promoter of the Nation of Islam for many years, saying that anybody who wasn't was evil. And then the Nation of Islam basically betrayed him. They said many horrible things about him. Even his best friends in the nation said that they would not support him. Nevertheless, he was directed to remain a member of the Nation of Islam, as they do not look fondly upon people who leave it. However, he did leave it eventually, and he was assassinated as a result. Of course, as a result, sadness was expressed by both Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and millions of people around the world. His legacy remains to be prominent in both moderate activists and radical activists. So, his effects can be seen around the world, and they will never fade out. I recommend you look into this one. It's very interesting. It's got a nice arc to the story, and of course has a sad ending. Alright, number 4, Mohandas Gandhi. So he was murdered by Natharam Godse. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. I'm actually going to pronounce it Godse. So Godse was angry at India's decision to give 420 million rupees to Pakistan, and he believed that he had been weakened when Pakistan gained independence. Godse was also an advocate of Hindu nationalism. This led him to believe that it was his responsibility to put 3 bullets into Mahatma Gandhi's chest. Very sad, Gandhi eventually fell to the ground and was eventually carried back to his room where he died. Very sad. Godse was quickly captured by members of the crowd and handed over to the police, and he was sentenced to death and is what is considered one of the quickest trials ever held in India. They were subsequently hung, as they should have been. Evil people deserve bad things to happen to them. Alright, let's move on to number 3. I don't know if this one really counts as an assassination, but the death of Marvin Gaye. Basically, he got in a fight with his parents, the famous singer, and his dad shot him. It's totally not funny. It's incredibly tragic. Apparently, the dad punched his mother, and Marvin Gaye started defending his mother, and his dad left and came back with a gun and shot his son. Very tragic story, but an interesting read if you want to delve in how relationships can be truly deadly. Apparently the conflict was started by an insurance letter, so it doesn't take much to spark such a horrible act to take place. Alright, number 2. This one's a bit more fun because it happened a while ago. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This is probably the most impactful assassination on this list, as it led to the First World War. He was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, who was one member of 7 in a terrorist organization who wanted to eliminate Ferdinand and ruling powers in order to gain independence from Austria-Hungary. In order to once again become part of Serbia. That's the boring part. The interesting part is the actual assassination, which was a complete disaster. They actually tracked down Franz Ferdinand's car while he was driving. They threw grenades at it. The grenades bounced off and blew up several buildings nearby. And the guards of the Duke subsequently made sure to protect him more thoroughly. It wasn't until later that afternoon, while Princip was sitting in a bar, that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand actually just walked right in, and Princip saw his opportunity and took it. He shot the Archduke, and World War I kicked off. Alright, number 1. There's a few honorable mentions, obviously Lincoln. And there's a couple French kings, but we're going to go ahead into number 1. Alright, so Philip II of Macedon, or Macedon, whichever you prefer. He was the father of Alexander the Great, and he was actually assassinated at his daughter's wedding. He was assassinated by a man named Pausanias, who was actually King Philip's bodyguard, as well as his lover. So, back then, it was very scandalous. It's much like Game of Thrones, if you go back and read about it. It's super interesting. Apparently, Pausanias was raped by one of Philip II's other bodyguards, Atlas. And King Philip II refused to punish Atlas. As a result, it is said that Pausanias, through a blind rage, killed his lover, Philip II. And it is said that the man was speared to death before he could escape. He was apparently very near escaping. He had a bunch of horses set up ready to go, but tripped on his way to his to his escape horse. There are many speculations that he was actually hired to murder the king by the king's own wife, Olympias, who's probably the most interesting woman in all of early history. She's really incredible. Probably the most interesting person in all of ancient history. It is said that she hired Pausanias to murder her husband in order to get Alexander into the throne, and later, of course, he became Alexander the Great, so it's not too unreasonable to speculate that she was part of the assassination. It's a very cinematic murder, very much like Game of Thrones. The king's at his daughter's wedding, and then he gets speared by his best friend who was hired by his wife. Very interesting, but unfortunately that's all I can give you for now. We've already gone way over, But I still have enough time to thank you for listening to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment if you like. And also remember to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Thank you, and have a good night.